All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today's deep dive takes us into the fascinating world of reincarnation research. And let's be honest, it's one of those topics that can really get people talking and maybe even arguing a bit. But hey, that's part of what makes it so intriguing, right? We're diving into some excerpts from Ian Stevenson's 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation, and I'm really curious to see what we can uncover.
Oh, absolutely. It's a topic that's ripe for exploration.
Yeah, and for those who might not be familiar, Ian Stevenson was a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, and he spent decades meticulously documenting cases of children who claimed to remember past lives.
20 cases is just a small selection from his vast body of work, really. His research spanned cultures and continents, really trying to get a global perspective on this phenomenon.
And what always strikes me about Stevenson's work is his approach. He wasn't just collecting anecdotal stories, he was digging deep, looking for concrete, verifiable details, names, dates, locations, even physical characteristics that might connect a child's memories to a specific deceased person.
Yeah, he was very aware of the need for evidence, especially in a field that often faces, well, a fair bit of skepticism.
Rightfully so, I think. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, as they say. So, to really grasp his methodology, let's dive into one of the cases from the book that highlights this evidence-based approach. Have you got one in mind?
I do, actually. There's a case from India, a young girl named Swarnlata Mishra, who, starting when she was just a little over 3 years old, began talking about a life she claimed to have lived as a woman named Baya Pathak.
Okay, hold on. A 3-year-old remembering a past life. Already, I'm hooked. What kind of things was she saying?
Well, her memories were surprisingly detailed. She talked about Bia's family, the layout of their house, even specific events from Bia's life, like a family trip to a particular temple.
Wow, that's pretty specific. I mean, could she have just overheard stories or seen pictures?
That's what you'd think, right? But there's more. Swarnlata could also sing songs that, get this, were unique to Bia's family.
Whoa, hold on. A toddler singing songs from a supposed past life. That's not your typical childhood make-believe.
Exactly. So Stevenson, intrigued, traveled to the village where this Bia Pathak had lived and interviewed her family members, carefully documenting everything.
Did anything match up?
To his astonishment, many of Swarnlata's claims were corroborated. She correctly identified members of Bia's family, described their home with remarkable accuracy, and even those unique songs, they were confirmed by Bia's relatives as songs specific to their family tradition.
Okay, that level of detail is hard to just brush aside as coincidence, right? It really makes you wonder, where could a 3-year-old get such specific information, especially about a family they'd never met?
That's the question that drove Stevenson's research. He was meticulous in exploring every possible conventional explanation. Could Swarnlata have overheard these stories, seen pictures, been told about Bia? But in this case, as in many others he investigated, the evidence just didn't point to any normal means of acquiring this knowledge.
It's like a puzzle, right? You're trying to fit the pieces together, and you can't quite figure out how they all connect.
Yeah, and that's what makes this whole field so fascinating, and I think, ultimately, why Stevenson dedicated his life to studying it.
It definitely makes you question our conventional understanding of memory, of consciousness itself. But all right, let's shift gears a bit, geographically speaking. For our next case, we're heading to Lebanon, the story of Imad Elawar.
Ah, yes, Imad. His case is quite different from Swarnlata's, but equally intriguing.
Okay, lay it on me. What makes Imad's case stand out?
Well, around the age of 2, he began claiming that he had lived before in a nearby village called Kribi. And here's the thing. Imad's family had absolutely no connection to this village. They'd never been there, had no relatives or friends who lived there, nothing.
So his talking about this place, it was completely out of the blue.
Totally. And it wasn't just vague pronouncements. He would talk about his previous name being Mahmoud Bahamzi, about having a wife and children, even specific things like owning a truck and a dog.
That's really specific. And did his family, try to figure out where he was getting these ideas from?
They were baffled, to say the least. There was no logical explanation for how he could know these things. And it got even stranger. He'd actually run ahead of his father on walks, acting like he knew the way, even though, again, they had never been to Kribi before.
Wow. So was anyone able to verify any of Imad's claims?
Eventually, as word spread and curiosity grew, some of Imad's family members decided to travel to Kribi just to see if there was any truth to his stories. And incredibly, they found a family with the last name Bohamzi.
No way! What are the odds?
It's pretty remarkable. And they discovered that this Bohamzi family did have a son named Mahmoud, who had tragically died in a truck accident some years earlier.
That's eerie, considering what Imad was saying. Did Stevenson get involved at this point?
Absolutely. This piqued his interest, and he arranged a visit to Kribi, taking Imad with him.
Okay, so they're bringing Imad, who claims to be the reincarnation of Mahmud, to the very village where Mahmud lived and died. This is getting intense. What happened during the visit?
Well, to put it simply, the results were remarkable. Imad was able to correctly identify Mahmud's former house, picking it out from a group of houses. He recognized and named several of Mahmud's family members, and even more astonishingly, he recalled personal details about Mahmud's life, specific events, relationships, even small habits, things that only those closest to Mahmud would have known.
Wow. I mean, the accuracy, the level of detail, it just adds another layer of intrigue to this whole concept of reincarnation. It really does make you question what we know about memory and consciousness, doesn't it?
Exactly. These cases challenge us to consider whether there might be more to our existence than what we can see and touch.
It definitely opens up a whole new world of possibilities. But before we, get too lost in the philosophical weeds, let's explore one more case from Stevenson's research, this time from the United States.
Okay, sounds good. What about the case of Corliss Chotkin Jr., a young boy from Alaska?
All right, a U.S. case. I'm curious to hear how it compares.
This one's a bit different from the previous two. Unlike Swarnlata and Imad, who recalled very specific names and details, Corliss primarily experienced, let's say, intense emotions and phobias that seemed to link to a past life.
Okay, that's interesting. What kind of emotions and phobias are we talking about?
From a very young age, Corliss was plagued by a recurring dream about being a pilot whose plane was shot down in a fiery crash.
Whoa. I mean, a recurring dream like that, especially for a young child, that must have been terrifying.
Absolutely, and it had a very real impact on his waking life. Corliss developed a severe, and I mean severe, fear of airplanes.
Which is kind of unusual for a kid growing up in Alaska, right? I mean, planes are a pretty common sight there.
Exactly. It's not like he was living in a place where planes were a rare or distant thing. His parents said he would cry and hide whenever he saw or heard a plane, and even just mentioning air travel would send him into a panic. It was clearly a very deep-seated phobia.
So how did Stevenson approach this case? I mean, it's not like he had specific names or locations to investigate like in the previous cases.
Right. It was a very different kind of challenge. Without those specific details, the investigation relied more on piecing together fragments of information, emotions, really trying to understand the underlying patterns. Stevenson meticulously interviewed Corliss and his parents, documenting the details of his dreams and this intense phobia. Then he delved into historical records, searching for any potential connections to plane crashes during wartime, anything that might resonate with Corliss's dream.
It sounds like searching for a needle in a haystack. Did he find anything?
After a lot of research, yes, he did. He uncovered records of a pilot named James Houston Jr. who had died in a plane crash during World War II.
So a potential match. But was there any direct link between Corliss's family and this James Houston?
No, not directly. But the circumstances of Houston's death, the imagery in Corliss's dreams, there were some striking parallels.
Okay, so even without specific names and locations, Stevenson was still able to uncover a possible link to a past life. That's pretty remarkable, isn't it?
It is. And it's these kinds of cases that really push the boundaries of our understanding and raise so many questions.
Yeah, how do you even begin to explain something like that?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? And as with any complex phenomenon, there are always alternative explanations to consider.
Right. Some might say, well, maybe Corliss's fear of planes stemmed from a traumatic event in his early childhood, even if he doesn't consciously remember it.
That's a possibility, of course. Early childhood experiences can have a profound impact on our fears and anxieties.
Absolutely. But at the same time, the vividness of Corliss's dreams, the specificity of his phobia, coupled with this historical connection to James Houston Jr., it just creates a very compelling narrative. It's hard to ignore.
And that's what I find so fascinating about Stevenson's work. He recognized that these cases often present a complex interplay of factors. And while we might not have definitive answers, exploring them, considering different perspectives, asking tough questions, that's how we move closer to understanding.
I completely agree. We've now explored 3 very different cases from different corners of the globe: India, Lebanon, the United States. Each one unique, but somehow connected by this underlying thread of reincarnation.
It's a thread that runs through cultures and time periods, and it seems through human consciousness itself.
Well said. My curiosity is definitely piqued.
Good. Because as we move forward, We're going to delve deeper into some of the commonalities that Stevenson observed across his decades of research, the recurring patterns, the challenges, and the enduring mysteries that make this such a captivating field of study.
Those cases we talked about, they were really something, huh? I mean, each one was so different, yet there's this connecting thread, this idea of reincarnation that ties them together. And I'm really eager to, well, kind of pull on that thread a bit. I know Stevenson, through all his research, found some common patterns, some things that kept popping up in these cases. So what were some of the things that stood out to him as he was investigating all these, these reports of past lives?
One of the most striking things, and I think you touched on this earlier, is how young these kids were when they started talking about these past life memories. We're not talking about adults having, some midlife crisis and inventing a dramatic backstory.
Right, right.
We're talking about toddlers, sometimes even younger, who just spontaneously start talking about another life they claim to have lived.
That's the part that always gets me. I mean, little kids, where else would they get these ideas? Especially with like the level of detail they sometimes have and the conviction.
Yeah, exactly. And that conviction, it's something Stevenson noted too. Often these memories, they just surface so naturally, like the kids weren't being prompted by adults or anything. They just start talking about their other life as if it was the most normal thing in the world.
Like they were remembering something that happened yesterday.
Yeah. And the details, the emotional intensity, it often seemed, well, kind of beyond their years.
And in some cases, it wasn't just talking, right? Those memories seemed to really affect how they felt, how they acted.
Oh, absolutely. Stevenson saw this a lot, actually. A lot of these kids, they showed really strong emotions connected to these past life memories, like deep sadness, anger, or even phobias that seem to relate to, well, how they supposedly died in that previous life.
Right, Corliss, the boy with the fear of planes. I mean, that was a pretty powerful example of that, right?
Yeah, definitely. And there are other cases, too. Kids who refused to eat certain foods because they said those foods made them sick in their past life, or who showed these, like, unusual skills or talents they seemingly had no way of learning in this life.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? It's like, even if those past life experiences weren't real, the way these kids feel about them, it's so real, so intense.
And that's the thing, right? Whether real or imagined, it seems like those experiences are somehow imprinted on these children's minds.
Okay, but I know there's another side to this. There are people who, well, they're skeptical about reincarnation. They offer different explanations. So what do they say? What are some of the counter arguments?
Right. Well, skeptics often point to things like childhood fantasy. Kids have such vivid imaginations.
Yeah.
And they're so easily influenced, the power of suggestion, all that. And of course, there's always the possibility that some families might be, well, let's say, fabricating or embellishing stories, maybe for attention or cultural reasons.
Yeah. I mean, kids are sponges. They pick up on everything. So maybe some of these cases could be explained by, like, them misinterpreting things they've seen or heard and then kind of building on that, creating their own stories.
That's definitely a possibility. And some critics of Stevenson's work have pointed out that, well, in certain cultures where reincarnation is already a widely accepted belief, there might be a tendency for families to interpret a child's, let's say, unusual behavior or statements through that lens, maybe even unconsciously.
Right. So, like, they're already primed to see it as evidence of a past life, even if there might be other explanations. That makes sense. But I'm curious, how did Stevenson address these criticisms? I mean, he was a scientist. He must have been aware of those potential biases.
Oh, he absolutely was. He was very aware, and he was incredibly methodical in his approach, always looking for other possible explanations, always considering those before even leaning towards reincarnation as an explanation. He actually conducted studies on twins, trying to see if maybe telepathy or some other kind of, well, paranormal communication might be at play in these cases.
Wow, so he was really trying to cover all the bases.
He really was. He developed a whole system for evaluating the evidence, taking into account, how much detail the child remembered, was it accurate, the emotional intensity, even looking for any physical marks or like birth defects that might match up with what the child was saying about their past life.
So it wasn't just about, like, collecting stories. He was actually analyzing them.
Right.
Looking for patterns, trying to identify the strongest cases.
Yeah, exactly. That's what sets his work apart. It's not just about believing or disbelieving. It's about trying to understand this phenomenon through observation, through evidence.
Oh, so after all that research, all those years of study, where did Stevenson end up? Like, did he ever say definitively, yes, reincarnation is real?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Stevenson himself, he never really came out and said he was a full-blown believer in reincarnation. He preferred to call himself a psychical researcher,
Yeah.
emphasizing that, he was focused on studying these phenomena that fall outside of traditional science.
So open to the possibility, but not necessarily saying he had proof.
Right. He acknowledged that there were, and still are, a lot of unanswered questions. But it's pretty clear from his writing that, he found the evidence for reincarnation pretty persuasive.
Intriguing. And even if you don't fully embrace this idea of reincarnation, his work really opens up some fascinating possibilities. I mean, it makes you think about consciousness in a different way, about memory, about what it even means to be human.
Absolutely. It challenges some very fundamental assumptions about life and death. I mean, if even a fraction of these cases turn out to be true, it would mean we need to rethink our whole understanding of how things work.
Big time. But okay, before we go down that rabbit hole too far, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, quantum physics. I mean, how does that fit into all of this?
Well, quantum physics, it's all about the behavior of matter and energy at the tiniest levels, atoms and all that. And it's given us some really interesting ideas about how consciousness might work. One concept that's gotten a lot of attention in relation to reincarnation is quantum entanglement.
Quantum entanglement. Okay, now we're getting into the really mind-bending stuff.
It is pretty mind-bending. Basically, it's this phenomena where two particles, they become linked together even when they're separated by huge distances. And whatever happens to one particle, it instantly affects the other, no matter how far apart they are.
Okay, so they're connected, but beyond space and time.
Kind of. And this idea, this interconnectedness, it's led some physicists to think that maybe consciousness isn't just limited to our brains. Maybe it's more like a fundamental property of the universe, somehow entangled or connected across space and time.
Whoa! So you're saying our minds aren't just these isolated things, they're somehow part of a bigger network of consciousness.
Exactly. And some people think that maybe under certain conditions, like, say, near-death experiences, or some even speculate during the process of death and rebirth, maybe those connections become stronger, allowing for, a transfer of memories or consciousness from one life to another.
Okay, that's pretty out there.
It is, yeah. I mean, this is all still very speculative.
Right. But still fascinating to think about.
Absolutely. It's one of those areas where science and spirituality kind of converge, which I think is always interesting.
It is. But I imagine there are plenty of people who, they think this quantum stuff is a bit too, I don't know, too out there to apply to consciousness and reincarnation.
Oh, for sure. There are definitely critics who say that, trying to use quantum physics to explain consciousness is, it's misinterpreting the science. They call it quantum mysticism, and they argue that there's no real evidence to support it.
Okay, so maybe not a definitive answer, but still a pretty interesting avenue to explore.
Definitely. And it highlights just how much we still don't know about both quantum physics and consciousness.
Yeah. Right. So it seems like we're left with more questions than answers.
That's often the case, especially when we're dealing with, the really big questions.
True. But those unanswered questions, that's what keeps us searching, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what drives us to explore, to learn, to keep pushing the boundaries of what we know.
Well said. We've really covered a lot of ground today. We've looked at these compelling cases, talked about common patterns, considered different perspectives, both skeptical and scientific. And while we might not have reached any firm conclusions, I definitely feel like I have a better understanding of just how complex this whole topic is.
Me too. And as we head into the last part of our deep dive, I think it'll be interesting to kind of zoom out a bit and think about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
What are the implications of all this? What can these cases teach us about, life, death, and how everything might be connected?
Okay, so we've gone through these really compelling cases, and we've touched on some pretty mind-bending scientific theories, and I think now I'm kind of curious about the big picture. Like, if we entertain this idea that reincarnation, that could be a real thing, what does that actually mean? What are the implications? It feels like we're stepping into a whole different way of thinking about life and death,
It definitely makes you rethink some pretty basic assumptions, right?
Yeah.
Like, what is life? What is death? What does it even mean to be a person, to have a self?
Right. It's like those questions that philosophers have been wrestling with forever, right? Like, are we just a bunch of experiences and memories that just end when our bodies die? Or is there something, some part of us, some soul or consciousness that keeps going, that carries those experiences into a new life?
It's a really profound question, and I think, yeah, if reincarnation is real, it kind of suggests that, well, that existence isn't just a straight line. It's more like a cycle, a circle.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's not just about living this one life the best you can. It's like there's this potential for learning and growth across multiple lives. Like taking what you learned in a past life and bringing it with you into this one, and then maybe into the next one after that, and so on.
Exactly. And think about karma.
Mm.
You know, if what we do in this life affects not just this life, but also future lives, that kind of changes things, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, it makes you think twice about your choices, knowing that what you do has these ripples that go way beyond what you can see.
Right. It's a lot of responsibility, but it also offers a kind of hope. It's like we're not just these limited beings stuck in this one lifetime. There's more to it than that.
I like that. I like that a lot. It's like, yeah, even our mistakes, our failures, they become part of this bigger story, this bigger journey.
Exactly. And it changes how you think about death too, right? It's not the end. It's more like a transition, a doorway to something new.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really powerful. But I also wonder, like, if we're constantly being reborn, where do all those memories go? Like, why do some people seem to remember past lives and others don't?
That's one of the big mysteries, right?
Yeah.
Some people think that maybe our past life memories, they're kind of stored in our subconscious mind, and we can only access them under certain conditions, like, those kids we talked about, or maybe through things like hypnosis or meditation.
So it's not that the memories are gone, they're just hidden. Like our minds are these giant libraries, and all those past lives are in there somewhere, but we can only see a few bookshelves at a time.
That's a great way to put it. And it makes you think, what's the purpose of those hidden memories? Maybe they're there to guide us or to teach us something, to help us through tough times in this life.
Ooh, yeah. Like maybe those moments where you have a gut feeling about something, or you get that sense of deja vu. Maybe that's a past life memory trying to break through.
Could be. It shows just how much we still don't know about the mind, about how it works, about what it's capable of.
So much mystery. But that's part of what makes this whole thing so fascinating, right?
Exactly. The mysteries keep us asking questions, keep us exploring.
Well, we've certainly done a lot of exploring in this deep dive. We've looked at cases from all over the world. We've delved into the science. We've pondered the deeper implications. I don't know about you, but I feel like my mind has been stretched,
Mine too. It's a good reminder that there's always more to learn, that there's always another layer to uncover.
Absolutely. And maybe, just maybe, those past lives, they're not as far away as we think. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.